I'm Marlene Atwood, 76 years old, and every morning starts the same way I wake up just before sunrise. No alarm clock, no noise, just habit. The quiet settles over my house like a second skin, a rhythm built from 50 years of routine. The dog stretches beside my bed, waiting for breakfast, and I move through the kitchen like I always have, polished floors, white cabinets, bills in a neat stack on the counter. It's the kind of morning I used to think would last forever. But that day, something shifted before we get too far into it. Go ahead and tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button. If you've ever felt underestimated by your own family. I live in a small town called Meadow Ridge out near the Nevada border. The kind of place where people still wave from their porches and know each other's dogs by name. My house sits on Willow Avenue, just a few blocks from the old fire station. It's not fancy, but it's mine. Built in the 1970s, paid off years ago, and still standing strong. I've kept it spotless every winter. I polish the wood floors by hand. Every spring, I change the curtains, same pale blue cotton with tiny stitched flowers. Herbert used to say the house looked like it held its breath when it was clean, like it didn't want to mess anything up. Herbert was my husband. 43 years of marriage gone. In an instant, he died behind the wheel of his rig out on I-80 between Salt Lake and home. Massive heart attack. He was 63. I was widowed by 62. We'd both worked all our lives. Me at Pioneer Life Insurance, him hauling freight across the country. We weren't flashy folks, but we believed in saving and living within our means. Herbert used to say, we were ants, not grasshoppers, always preparing, always putting a little something away after he passed. I kept going. Same routines, same habits. I walked Chester every morning, cooked simple meals, tracked every dime in my ledger. By then our investments had matured, and the life insurance payout gave me even more stability. I never needed to worry, not once. But no one knew that, not even my son. My son's name is Daniel. Folks call him Dan. He left Meadow Ridge the second he got his college acceptance letter, went to school in Reno, got his CPA license, and married Claire. She runs a recruiting firm and talks like she's always in a hurry. I don't hold it against them wanting more for themselves. Herbert and I wanted that too. That's why we saved. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing value in how I lived. They looked at my home and saw a woman stuck in the past, when really, I just liked things to be simple. They'd visit once or twice a year, always with an edge to their words. Claire, with her manicured nails scanning the living room like she was expecting chipped paint and sagging furniture. Dan glancing at the thermostat like the air conditioning couldn't possibly be efficient. You know, Mom, he said, last time you could get a place in Reno? More modern? Safer near us? I nodded but didn't. But agree because the truth was, I liked my quiet neighborhood with its familiar mailman and the Chen family across the street who bring me dumplings every Sunday. They didn't know about the trust accounts or the dividend statements tucked in my secretary desk. They didn't know I'd bought a house last month, a real house, a $5 million place in Lake Ridge, just 20 minutes outside Reno with a view of the lake, and a rose garden big enough to make Herbert weep. They didn't know, because I never told them the idea had been growing. Ever since my friend Eleanor passed, she was my age, but always said she'd wait till retirement to travel to Host, to buy the lake house she dreamed of. Then the cancer came, and the chance was gone. I helped her daughter Martha pack up the place. We found photo albums, wedding china lists of dreams never taken off the page on the drive home that night. Something clicked. Maybe it was the photo of us in caps and gowns, class of 65. Maybe it was the scent of Eleanor's perfume still lingering in her hallway. But I pulled into my driveway and thought, I've waited long enough. I called a realtor the next morning. The voice on the other end asked for my price range, and I said calmly, 3 to 5 million. She paused, then stammered, Ma'am, did you say million? I said yes, I did, and that was that. I've been packing in secret ever since ordering furniture off catalog sites, hiring movers under my maiden name, and now Dan and Claire are coming to visit again. They think they're going to tell me what's best for me again? They have no idea what's coming. Dan and Claire pulled up to the curb 15 minutes late. I watched from the front window as he parked his Audi too close to the mailbox, the engine cutting off with that sharp hum new cars make. Claire got out first, smooth and crisp in white slacks and a sleeveless blouse that probably cost more than my entire summer wardrobe. She opened the back door and pulled out a wine bag, then paused to adjust her hair in the side mirror. Dan followed a second later, checking his phone before walking up the path. I had the front door open before they could knock. "Mom," Dan said, leaning in with a quick hug that barely touched my shoulders. Claire offered a polite smile and held up the bag. "We brought a bottle of Pinot and a wedge of Manchego," she said. "I hope you have proper wine glasses." "I do," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "Come on in. I just took a pie out of the oven." Dan and Claire sat on the couch, and I took my usual chair by the fireplace. Chester hovered in the corner, tail still ears perked. He didn't approach them, which was unlike him. I poured the tea, brought out plates, and set the pie down in the center of the coffee table. Claire declined a slice, murmuring something about gluten. Dan helped himself to a generous piece and complimented the smell, though I noticed he barely took a bite. "So," he said, setting down his fork, "there's something we've been meaning to talk to you about." I glanced up. "You're the ones who called, I said so. I assumed you had something important to discuss." Dan looked over at Claire. She nodded once, and he cleared his throat. "It's about your future mom. We've been thinking a lot lately about what's best for you. The neighborhood's not what it used to be. The house is getting older. You're alone." Claire picked up the thread. "There are some wonderful independent living communities in Reno. Not nursing homes per se. More like active adult communities. With on-site medical planned activities, private apartments. They're beautiful, really." I poured more tea. "And how do you think I'd pay for one of those?" Dan didn't look up. "Well, we could sell this house. It's not in the best part of town anymore, but it would bring in a decent amount. And of course, your pension." "My pension barely covers groceries and water bills," I said. "You know that." He nodded quickly. "We'd help with the difference." I set down the teapot and folded my hands. "Dan, what's this really about?" He blinked. "I told you, we just want what's best for you." "No," I said, holding his gaze. "You want something?" "What is it?" Claire shifted in her seat. "It's not just the house," she said. "There's also the land your parents left you. The 6 acres off Highway 80, remember? That's what really brought this conversation up." Dan leaned forward. "There's a development firm that's made an offer. They want to build a shopping center. They're offering $800,000, which is honestly generous for a piece of land that's just sitting empty." I sat quietly watching the two of them. Dan looked like a schoolboy trying to sell a science project. Claire was watching me like I was a bank teller, deciding whether to cash her check. "And you want me to sell it?" I said. "To them." Dan nodded. "It would fund everything. The community, your care, and we'd help manage the transition. And there might be more opportunities down the line." Claire crossed her legs and folded her hands on her lap. "There's even talk of offering early investment options. If we get in now, we could become minority partners." I turned my head and looked out the window for a moment. The tomato beds were still green from this morning's watering. The basil was full, nearly ready to clip. "That land is worth at least $1.5 million, I said quietly. "Probably more. I've kept up with the zoning changes." Claire scoffed. "With respect, how would you know that I read the same papers you do?" I said. "And I still know how to read a balance sheet." Dan sat back and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, be reasonable. We're trying to make this easy for you. You can't live here alone forever. What if something happens? What if you fall? What if there's a break-in? I have neighbors," I said. "People who check in, who bring me things. People who say hello. When's the last time you called me just to talk?" Dan Claire's mouth tightened. "The street isn't safe anymore. The people here, Watch your tone in my house, I said sharper than I intended. Dan stood up abruptly. Mom, this place is falling apart. The roof is probably leaking. Your car's outdated. Your appliances belong in a museum. I stood up too. Say what you mean, Dan. He looked at me, his face flushed. Fine. You're living in this dump because you've got nothing. Because you've always saved every penny, denied yourself everything. And where has it gotten you? You're sitting in a decaying house alone like a beggar. The room went silent. Chester let out a low whine and disappeared behind the chair. I reached into the secretary drawer and pulled out the envelope. Inside were 6 photographs, glossy and sharp. I handed them to him. What's this? He asked. My new house, I said. I move in tomorrow. He blinked. Claire leaned in and her eyes widened. That's the mansion in Lakeview, she whispered. The one that was listed for $5 million. I nodded. I paid the full price. No haggling. Dan looked at me completely stunned. Where did you get that kind of money? I walked to the kitchen and came back with a folder of documents, purchase receipts, investment statements, trust certificates. Your father and I were careful, I said. We invested. We didn't show off. But we built something. Claire shook her head slowly. $5 million is more than careful saving, Marlene. That's unbelievable. There's more, I said. Much more. But it doesn't matter to you. What matters is that I'm not the helpless old woman you thought I was. Dan sank into the couch, the photographs still in his hands. I don't understand, he said softly. No, I said. I know you don't. Claire looked toward the door. We need time to process this. Dan stood still, stunned. Are you really moving? Yes, I said. Tomorrow. They walked to the door without another word. Dan turned at the last second, opened his mouth like he might say something, but didn't. They got into the Audi and drove off, the tires crunching over the gravel. I closed the door gently behind them and leaned against it. Chester came out from under the table and looked up at me. It's all right now, I whispered, resting a hand on his head. We're just getting started. The morning of the move came early. I was awake before the sun rose, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. Chester stirred at the foot of the bed, let out a soft whine, and nudged his head up over the edge of the quilt. I sat up slowly, rubbed my knees, and whispered, Yes, buddy, today's the day. I pulled on my robe and padded into the kitchen. All but one teacup had been packed away. I kept my favorite out, a ceramic mug with English wildflowers painted around the rim. Herbert had given it to me for our 30th anniversary. I boiled water, made a cup of tea, and stood in the center of the kitchen, holding it with both hands. The pie tin from yesterday was still cooling on the counter, empty now, except for a few crumbs. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon polish. Boxes lined the hallway labeled in my handwriting, kitchen bedroom books photos. Each one had a small yellow sticker, the kind I used back in my accounting days, color-coded and efficient. The house looked unfamiliar with the pictures taken down and the corners cleared out. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room felt louder in the emptiness. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. 3 young men stood on the porch in navy t-shirts, their truck already backed into the driveway. Mrs. Atwood, one of them asked, We're from Reliable Moving. We'll get you all taken care of. They worked with quiet focus, lifting boxes 2 at a time, patting the corners of the door frames. I stayed out of the way, sitting in the same chair Dan had slouched in the day before. Chester kept watch beside me, ears up, tail curled around his paws. Every so often, he let out a low grunt when they moved something large. Around 11:30, my phone rang. Dan's name lit up the screen. I let it go. A minute later, it rang again, this time Claire. Then Dan again. By noon, I had 6 missed calls and a couple of unread messages. I didn't open them. Not yet. At 1 o'clock, the last of the furniture was loaded. The lead mover came back inside with a clipboard. "All set, ma'am. Want to ride with us or follow in your own car? I'll drive myself," I said. "I need a few more minutes." They pulled away slowly, the truck humming at the end of the block. The street grew quiet again, the same way it always did after school drop-off or just before dinner. I walked through each room one last time. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents, the hallway where Dan once tried to roller skate indoors and knocked over a plant. The back porch still had the small dip in the boards where Herbert used to sit in his rocking chair. I paused there longest. The tomatoes in the garden were just starting to ripen. I'd told the couple buying the house they could take whatever grew this year. They'd smiled and said their little boy loved fresh tomatoes. I whispered goodbye to the empty rooms. Then I locked the front door and slid the key into an envelope for the new owners. Chester hopped into the front seat of the car without needing to be told. He looked out the window the entire drive. Meadow Ridge gave way to the wider roads that wound out toward Reno. The landscape changed little by little. Older homes replaced by larger properties. Chain-link fences gave way to iron gates and tall hedges. When I turned onto Lakeview Drive, the difference was impossible to miss. The house sat at the end of a long, curved driveway perched on a rise above the lake. The moving truck was already there. Cassidy, my realtor, stood waiting at the foot of the steps holding a bouquet of tulips. "Welcome home, Mrs. Atwood," she said, smiling. "Thank you," I said, taking the flowers. "You've been very kind." She walked me through everything: the keypad at the side door, the temperature controls, the lighting system I'd probably never use in full. The movers started bringing things inside. I directed traffic room by room, letting the old pieces find new corners. My dining table looked small in the new space, but I liked it that way. I wasn't in a rush to buy more. By 6 o'clock, the last box had been set down, the moving crew thanked and tipped, and Cassidy had gone. The house was quiet again. Chester walked the rooms with his nose low to the floor, then settled in front of the sliding glass doors that opened to the back terrace. I stepped out into the garden. The lawn curved gently toward the lake, bordered by tidy flower beds and soft shrubs. The wind off the water was cool. I stood there for a long while, not thinking about anything at all. My phone rang again. Dan. Then again. Claire. I muted the ringer and set it face down on the counter. Chester came to stand beside me, leaned into my leg. "We're going to like it here," I said. The first night in the new house was the hardest. Everything echoed slightly. The mattress was brand new and too soft. The windows were bigger, and the moonlight poured in like water. I got up twice just to walk the halls, familiarizing myself with the sound of the place. The next morning, I made coffee in the new machine, took a few tries to figure out the right button. I brought the cup out to the terrace and sat in one of the patio chairs, still in my robe, watching the sun rise over the water. The quiet was different here, less familiar, but gentle. A little after 10, the doorbell rang. I checked the screen at the front door. A woman stood there holding a basket. When I opened the door, she smiled warmly. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Olivia Parker. I live next door just across the hedge." I introduced myself and invited her in. We sat in the living room. She handed me the basket, banana bread, a jar of homemade jam, a folded pamphlet about the local gardening society. "Just wanted to say welcome," she said. "We're a friendly neighborhood. If you ever need anything, just knock." She told me about the book club, the summer barbecues by the lake, and the farmers market that's set up twice a month near the cul-de-sac. I told her I'd be happy to join the book club. She promised to send me the reading list. After she left, I took Chester for a walk through the neighborhood. Wide sidewalks, clean streets, neat lawns. We passed a man walking a golden retriever. He waved and stopped. "Beautiful day," he said. "I'm Walter." "Just up the hill, blue house with the cedar porch." "Marlene," I said. "Just moved in yesterday." We talked for a few minutes while our dogs sniffed at one another. Before he left, he mentioned a classical concert at the Cultural Center the following Friday. Said he'd be going and would be happy for company. I told him I'd think about it. When I got home, the phone was blinking again. More missed calls, more unread messages. I didn't open any of them. Not yet. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched Chester nap in the sunlight. The move was done. The house was mine. Everything after this, how I lived, who I welcomed, what I gave my time to, that would be up to me. My first full week in the new house passed quietly. I unpacked the last of the boxes on Thursday afternoon and placed Herbert's old clock on the mantel. It ticked with the same soft rhythm. It always had a sound I hadn't realized I missed until the silence of the new place made space for it. Chester settled in faster than I expected. He claimed the sunniest corner of the living room and hardly moved from it except to follow me out to the terrace or over to the garden. I kept my days simple. In the morning, I made coffee and walked the garden paths before the heat rolled in. Around mid-morning, I would take Chester on a stroll around the neighborhood. People were kind neighbors, waved a few, stopped to introduce themselves, and someone had left a pot of petunias on my front steps with a note that said, "Welcome to Lakeview." Walter showed up again during one of our walks. He was wearing a straw hat and walking his golden retriever, Benji. We talked about the upcoming concert, and I told him I'd decided to come. He offered to drive, said he knew the shortcuts. I agreed. The inside of the house was slowly taking shape. I ordered a few new chairs for the sitting room and hung framed family photos in the upstairs hallway. Olivia from next door dropped off a reading list for the book club. The first meeting was coming up next Thursday, and I'd already made it halfway through the novel. It was the kind of quiet I hadn't known I needed. Evenings on the terrace, Chester curled at my feet, the lake catching the colors of the setting sun. By the end of the third week, I'd stopped checking my phone for missed calls. I hadn't heard from Dan or Claire since the move. But one Tuesday morning, just after breakfast, Maria, my housekeeper, called up from the front hall. "Mrs. Atwood, your son and his wife are here to see you." I hadn't expected them. I looked down at the robe I was still wearing, then up at the clock. Just past 9. I told Maria to bring them out back to the terrace. I set out an extra cup and put out a small plate of shortbread cookies I'd made the day before. I smoothed my hair and stepped outside. Dan and Claire followed Maria through the doors a moment later. Dan wore a cashmere sweater over linen pants. Claire was in a slate blue dress and low heels, her pearl necklace catching the morning sun. Her eyes scanned the garden, then the house behind me. Mom, Dan said, smiling, "You look amazing." I nodded toward the chairs across from me. "Sit down. Would you like coffee?" Claire blinked. "You have a housekeeper?" "Yes." "Maria comes twice a week. I also have a gardener named Jorge who tends the roses. At my age, it's easier to have help." They sat down. Claire crossed her legs, fingers fiddling with the clasp of her handbag. I waited. Chester lay beside my chair, watching them with his head tilted slightly. Dan cleared his throat. "We wanted to come by to apologize for how we handled things before." I was out of line. Claire nodded quickly. "We were both surprised by everything. It caught us off guard. But now we understand you just wanted to live your life, and that's totally fine." I didn't say anything. I poured coffee into the 2 cups and passed them over. Dan took a sip. Claire held hers without drinking. "There's something else," he said, after a pause. "A business matter, actually." I glanced at him but said nothing. Dan leaned forward slightly. "Remember the development project we mentioned, the shopping center on the land outside Reno? It's changed. Claire took over. It's not just retail anymore. They're now planning an entire mixed-use complex, offices, dining, maybe even a boutique hotel. It's going to be huge. They're offering more now," Dan said. $2 million just for the land. But that's not all. If we invest more, say 10 million, we could become real partners in the project. Major equity. Claire nodded. We spoke with the lead investor. They're looking for backers with capital but no management responsibilities. You'd be completely hands-off. I set my cup down. You want me to invest $10 million? Dan smiled slightly. It's a win-win. You'd make a great return, and we'd manage the details. Claire has experience negotiating vendor contracts, and I've already run the projections. I looked at the two of them. And how much are you putting in? Dan hesitated. We have about 300,000 we can use. So, I contribute 10 million. You contribute 300,000. And then what? Claire leaned in. You'd get a larger share, of course. But we'd handle everything. You wouldn't have to do a thing. Chester stirred beside me and let out a soft, low growl. I reached down and rested a hand on his back. You know what surprises me? I said. It's not the proposal. It's that you walked in here and never asked how I'm doing. You didn't ask if I was happy. You didn't ask about Chester. You just sat down and went straight into a business pitch. Dan's smile faltered. That's not fair. We came to apologize, didn't we? I looked at him. When's the last time you called to say hello? Not to suggest a plan or offer help. Just to talk. Claire stiffened. We thought you needed space after everything. I did, I said, and I still do. Claire stood up quickly. Her coffee sloshed and hit the edge of the table. I knew this would happen, she said. You're always suspicious, always holding on to every dime like it's some kind of contest. Dan looked startled. Claire. She kept going. You finally come into money and you're still the same woman who shops the clearance rack. Honestly, Dan, is it any wonder you stopped visiting? I stayed seated, resting my hands in my lap. Thank you for your honesty, Claire. Dan stood too clearly unsure of what to say. Mom, she didn't mean it like that. I raised a hand. You should go now. I have things to do. They hesitated for a second, then turned and walked through the glass doors. Chester didn't move until they were gone. Then he laid his head across my feet. The breeze lifted through the trees and the lake shimmered in the sunlight. The morning after Dan and Claire's visit, I walked down to the water's edge and stood barefoot in the dewy grass. The lake was still and smooth as glass, the sky pale with just a hint of color warming near the horizon. Chester nosed at something in the shrubs, but didn't bark. Everything around me was quiet, clean. I stayed there for a long time. Later that day, I called my attorney, Mr. Lyman. He'd handled Herbert's affairs years ago, and I trusted him. I asked if he could come out to the house later in the week. He said Thursday would work. I told him I wanted to make some changes to the trust, nothing urgent, but something I'd been thinking about for a while. He arrived that Thursday just after lunch, slim briefcase in one hand, gray suit even in the heat. I had iced tea waiting on the patio. We sat at the round iron table under the umbrella. Chester curled beneath my chair. I appreciate you making the drive, I said. Of course, he said, setting the briefcase down. You mentioned changes, I nodded. I want to amend the distribution plan. The primary beneficiaries are staying the same, but I'd like to adjust how and when the money is accessed. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small notepad. Go on. I explained that I didn't want to disinherit anyone, but I also didn't want to leave anything open to misuse. I wanted to restructure Dan and Claire's access to the trust, limit it to modest annual distributions with the rest held until certain conditions were met. I wasn't punitive about it. I just wanted to put guardrails in place. I'd also like to make some gifts, I added, to people who've been kind, who've shown up without expecting anything. He looked up. You have someone in mind? Yes, my housekeeper Maria. My gardener, Jorge. And Olivia from next door. She's been a wonderful neighbor. There are others I'm still thinking about. He nodded. We can set up legacy gifts or living disbursements. Would you like to involve Dan and Claire in the process? No, I said. I'll tell them when I'm ready. Not before. We spent the afternoon drafting the changes. He showed me where to initial, where to sign. When he left, I felt something I hadn't in months calm. Not relief, not triumph, just a clear, steady quiet. That weekend, I baked again. This time, it was cornbread muffins, the kind Herbert always liked with honey and butter. I packed a few in a basket with a fresh jar of blackberry jam and walked them over to Olivia. She was out back pruning a hydrangea bush in her wide-brimmed hat. Oh, Marlene, you didn't have to do that, she said. I know I said, but I wanted to. She invited me in for iced coffee. We sat at her kitchen table and talked about the book club, the upcoming concert at the lakefront amphitheater, and how fast the summer was passing. Her daughter was coming to visit from Oregon. I said I hoped I'd get to meet her. By mid-July, I'd settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for the garden. Afternoons, I read or sewed. Some evenings, I had dinner on the patio with Olivia or Walter. No pressure, no demands, just easy company. One Thursday afternoon, Walter stopped by with a sack of peaches from a roadside stand up north. Said they were the best in the county. I made cobbler and dropped off a dish at his house the next day. He invited me to go to the art museum in the city with him that Saturday. I said yes. The drive was lovely. He took the scenic route, pointing out wildflowers and stopping once so I could take a photo of a hawk perched on a fence post. At the museum, we strolled through rooms of oil paintings and blown glass. He knew a surprising amount about sculpture, and I found myself enjoying the way he noticed details, how he paused to read every plaque, how he leaned slightly to the side when considering a painting. We had a quiet dinner afterward at a restaurant with candles on the tables and cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. When he dropped me off, he walked me to the door. I hope I didn't keep you too long, he said. Not at all, I said. Thank you for the company. That night, Chester rested his head in my lap while I sat on the sofa with a book. The house felt warmer somehow, not just from the summer air, but from the pieces of life slowly forming around me. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply being. A few days later, I went into town for a haircut and stopped at the little stationery store near the post office. They still sold real note cards, embossed thick stock elegant edges. I bought a small box of cream-colored ones and a new pen. That evening, I wrote 2 letters. One to Maria, thanking her for the kindness she showed not just in her work, but in how she spoke to Chester. The other to Jorge, who always clipped the rose bushes just the way Herbert used to like them. I enclosed a note with the trust details Mr. Lyman had prepared, small gifts, but enough to make a difference. I mailed them the next morning early before the sun got too high. The last letter I wrote was to Dan. I told him the trust had been adjusted, that I wasn't cutting him off, but I was making sure what I'd built wouldn't be turned into a business plan. I didn't explain the details. I just said that from now on, any generosity would be on my terms. I didn't hear back. That weekend, Olivia invited me to her daughter's garden party. Walter was there too. He brought lemonade and wore a button-down shirt with tiny sailboats on it. We sat in lawn chairs under a maple tree and watched the sun go down. It was a Monday when Dan called. His voice was flat, professional, clipped. He said he and Claire would be stopping by that Friday. We have something to go over with you, he said. I told him I'd be home. The sky was clear that morning. I watered the flowers, wiped down the patio chairs, and baked a fresh peach galette. It wasn't for them, not really. It was for the house. For me. Something about the smell of cinnamon and butter always made the rooms feel sturdier. They pulled up around 11. Claire wore a navy pantsuit like she was headed to a conference. Dan had a folder under his arm. I opened the door and stepped aside without saying much. Chester stayed by my feet, tail still, eyes watchful. We sat in the living room. Claire crossed her legs tightly, smoothing her slacks before speaking. "Marlene," she began, "we wanted to talk to you about the trust." Dan glanced at her, then back at me. "You've made some changes." "I have," I said, folding my hands in my lap. Claire leaned forward. "We've consulted an attorney. He's drawn up an advisory plan we believe will help protect your assets long term." I didn't say anything. She went on. "We're concerned about mismanagement. There are signs you've been giving away funds in ways that don't align with sound estate planning." Dan slid the folder across the coffee table toward me. "We'd like you to review this. It outlines a revised framework, oversight provisions, distribution tiers, revocable clauses. We can walk you through it." I picked up the folder. The front page had my name in bold letters. Inside were typed paragraphs, charts, signatures. I skimmed a few lines. Then I set it down. "Who's the trustee in this version?" I asked. Dan hesitated, jointly held between myself and Claire. Chester shifted beside me. I reached down and scratched behind his ear. "I see," I said. Claire leaned in again. "It's really for your benefit. We want to keep things organized and legally protected. And frankly, you've been impulsive." The word hung in the air like a chill. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, poured 3 glasses of water, carried them back, and set one in front of each of us. "I made some galette this morning," I said. "Peach with local honey. Would you like some?" Claire blinked. "I know, thank you." Dan said nothing. I sat again. The folder was still between us. I let a pause settle long and steady. "I've already spoken with Mr. Lyman," I said. "The changes to the trust are complete. They're legally binding. He has copies." Claire's expression didn't change, but her posture did, shoulders tighter, eyes more focused. "You understand that this affects more than just you, right?" she said. "There are tax implications, retirement accounts, property transitions." "I understand what's mine," I said. Dan finally spoke. "You're being emotional." I looked at him for the long moment. "And you're not." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Claire straightened. "We just want to help." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm offering you a glass of water instead of showing you the door." That quieted things. After another minute, Claire stood. Dan followed. Neither touched the folder. At the door, Claire turned to me. "This won't end well," she said. "I've already lived through the worst," I said. "This part's just the cleanup." They left without another word. Their tires whispered against the gravel as they backed out of the drive. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned my forehead against the wood. Chester brushed against my leg. I turned and walked to the kitchen, cut a slice of galette, and carried it to the back porch. The sun was higher now, warm on the flagstone. I sat and took a bite. The crust was flaky, the peaches soft. I watched 2 robins hop across the lawn, searching for something under the surface. That evening, Walter called, said there was a bluegrass concert down at the dock the next night, and asked if I wanted to join him. I said yes. The fundraiser was held at the Lake Ridge Cultural Center, just off the marina. It was the kind of place with wide glass doors, soft lighting, and linen-covered tables lined up in rows. I wore a deep green dress that hit just below the knee, the kind of fabric that draped without clinging. Walter picked me up right on time. He was in a navy blazer, freshly shaved, with a small spray of cologne I hadn't smelled since Herbert's retirement party in '99. We arrived just before 7. The front lobby buzzed with chatter, the kind of polite hum that floats above clinking glasses. The event was for the Lakeside Art School Scholarship's new classroom's endowments. I'd made a sizable donation a few weeks earlier under the name M. Atwood Foundation. It was something I'd been thinking about since Eleanor passed. A young woman in a silver dress greeted us at the door. "Mrs. Atwood," she said, "thank you so much for your gift. The gallery wing is being renamed in your honor. The director would love to introduce you after the opening remarks." Walter looked over at me with a small smile. I nodded and thanked her, then followed the flow of the room toward the catering table. It was while I was deciding between the spinach tartlets or the smoked salmon that I heard her voice. "Claire." She was standing across the room beside a man in a pinstripe suit. She wore a sleeveless black dress and low heels. Her hair was pulled into a twist the way she wore it at board meetings. I didn't think she'd seen me yet. Walter leaned in. "Want to step outside for a minute?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "Let's stay." The director took the microphone near the grand piano. She thanked the guests, mentioned the students spoke of legacy. Then she said my name, Marlene Atwood, who many of you may know from her community work in Meadow Ridge, made an extraordinary contribution this month. Thanks to her generosity, the gallery wing will expand to include 2 new studios and a community exhibit space. Please join me in thanking her. The spotlight shifted. Faces turned. Claire's eyes found mine across the room. I smiled. People clapped. Some stood. I walked forward slowly, steady, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. Walter gave my hand a small squeeze before letting go. The director gestured toward the plaque resting on a velvet easel. "We'll install this next week," she said. The gold letters read, "The Marlene Atwood Wing, in honor of lifelong generosity and quiet strength." Claire was frozen near the back. Her posture was rigid, eyes slightly narrowed. I caught just a flicker of something in her face, not surprise, not anger exactly. It was something harder to name. I made my way back to Walter's side. The speeches moved on. Donations announced, plans unveiled. But I could feel Claire watching me. When the string quartet started up and people began drifting toward the wine tables, Claire walked over. "Marlene," she said. "Claire." She looked around, then stepped a little closer. "I didn't know you were involved with this center. I've been supporting it for years," I said. Quietly until now. She nodded once. The donation was substantial. I looked over at the plaque. It felt right. She hesitated. "Dan mentioned you were moving into the city." "I closed on the house 3 months ago." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Another pause. She smoothed the fabric of her dress. "Dan, he's been under pressure lately. Work the boys, everything. He doesn't always handle things well." I looked at her. "We weren't trying to take anything from you," she said. "We just thought—" She stopped herself. I waited. She cleared her throat. "Your place in Lake Ridge, it's beautiful. And this," she motioned around the room. "It's impressive. Thank you." She opened her mouth again, but nothing came. After a moment, she gave a quick nod and stepped away. Walter and I stayed another hour. We walked through the student art displays, spoke to a young man who'd just won a scholarship, and shared a small plate of lemon shortbread. By the time we left, the sky had turned soft with stars, and the air smelled faintly of pine. Back in the car, Walter turned down the radio. "That woman who came over, was that your daughter-in-law?" "It was." He nodded, eyes on the road. "Did she come to congratulate you? Something like that?" He didn't ask more. We pulled up to my new house a little after 10. The porch light glowed, and the garden path looked silver under the moon. Before I stepped out, Walter leaned over and said, "They may have underestimated you, but I don't think anyone here tonight will make that mistake again." I nodded, then stepped into the quiet night. Dan didn't call until the following week. It was late afternoon, the kind of day where the wind makes the porch chimes sing and the kettle takes its time to boil. I let the phone ring twice before answering. He got right to it. No hello, no how have you been. Just said he'd heard about the fundraiser. Said people were talking. They said you looked important, he mumbled. That you were being honored. That you gave a fortune. I waited. Then he asked if I'd consider having lunch. Said he was ready to have a proper conversation. His voice was steadier than I expected, but there was a hesitance under it, the kind that comes when someone realizes they may have miscalculated. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I was well, that the house suited me, that I'd taken up reading poetry again. And then, as gently as I could, I said, Dan, I think we both know this conversation should have happened a long time ago, back when all I wanted was to be treated with decency, not distance. You chose what mattered to you. I've made peace with that. There was a silence on the other end. I didn't mean to. I know, I said, but I'm not waiting to be invited in anymore. I'm already home. We exchanged a few polite words after that about the boys, about the weather, and then the line went quiet. I set the phone down, turned off the kettle, and walked out to the garden. The rosemary was coming in strong. The lavender, too. Birds flitted through the apple tree, dipping down toward the little ceramic dish I'd filled with water that morning. I stood there for a long time. Claire never followed up. No cards, no messages. But sometimes I'd catch her name on the donor list in the town paper. A small gift here, a scholarship there. I didn't read into it. The truth is, I'd built something of my own, not to spite them, but to remember who I was when nobody else did. The friendships I'd made, the students I'd helped, the peace I'd found in this new chapter. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation, justice. I've come to understand doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as quiet as sipping tea on your own porch with no one to answer to but the breeze. If you've ever had to start over from the ground up, if you've ever had to rebuild not just your life, but your sense of worth, I hope you know that quiet strength counts too. And if this story stayed with you, I'd love to know where you listened from. Feel free to share or subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. But even if you don't, I'm glad you stayed with me till the end.